December 1930. A German infantry training unit conducts winter exercises near Kazan in Soviet Russia. The landscape is frozen, empty, except for scattered farm buildings and what appears to be agricultural equipment moving across a distant field. The instructor points toward the shape and begins explaining Soviet farming techniques when the tractor rotates its front section and the machine gun opens fire. Blank rounds, training ammunition, but the shock is absolute. The German soldiers dive for cover, their minds struggling to reconcile what they are seeing. That is not a tractor, that is a tank. More specifically, that is a T-18 light tank disguised as a Fordson Putilov tractor, and its existence violates multiple international treaties. The Germans know this because they helped design it. This was not an accident of industrial camouflage. This was deliberate, systematic deception on a scale that would define Soviet military development for the next 2 decades. The vehicles officially designated as tractors in Soviet industrial records would eventually number in the thousands. They would fight in Poland, Spain, Finland, and finally against the very German forces that had helped create them. They would terrify infantry units who thought they were facing agricultural equipment until the moment guns emerged and armor advanced. They represented something unique in military history, a weapon system that existed in plain sight while officially not existing at all. The problem facing the Soviet Union in 1920 was simple to state and nearly impossible to solve legally. The Treaty of Versailles had ended the First World War, and its provisions extended beyond Germany to restrict military development across Europe. Allied inspection commissions monitored weapons production. International observers watched factories. The Soviet Union, desperate to modernize its military after the catastrophic losses of World War I and the Russian Civil War, found itself unable to openly develop the armored fighting vehicles it desperately needed. Soviet industry lacked the expertise. Soviet engineers lacked the experience. Soviet military doctrine was trapped in the 19th century while Western nations were already experimenting with mechanized warfare. What the Soviets needed was knowledge, technology, and above all, the ability to develop armored vehicles without triggering international intervention. What they found was a partner with identical problems and complementary needs. Germany, stripped of its military power by Versailles, forbidden from developing tanks or military aircraft, needed testing grounds and development facilities beyond the reach of Allied inspectors. The solution was obvious to both nations, even if admitting it would have violated every diplomatic principle both claimed to uphold. Beginning in 1922, Germany and the Soviet Union entered into secret military collaboration agreements that would reshape both nations' armed forces and eventually help enable the Second World War. The Kama Tank School opened near Kazan in 1926 under the official designation of Heavy Vehicle Testing Facility. The name was technically accurate. The facility tested heavy vehicles. It simply omitted that these vehicles were armed, armored, and specifically designed to destroy enemy forces. German engineers arrived under civilian cover, employed by shell companies with agricultural equipment contracts. Soviet engineers worked alongside them, learning techniques that Western nations had spent years developing. The knowledge transfer was mutual. Germans gained access to testing grounds where they could develop prototypes forbidden under Versailles. Soviets gained access to German engineering expertise and design philosophy. Both nations gained plausible deniability. If questioned, these were tractors. Heavy tractors certainly, with unusually thick steel bodies and curious rotating turrets, but tractors nonetheless. The paperwork said so. The industrial classifications confirmed it. The official designations used agricultural terminology. The T-18, Soviet Russia's first domestically produced tank, appeared in industrial records as the Ruski Renault tractor. Its design drew heavily from captured French Renault FT tanks from World War I, but Soviet engineers had modified it extensively based on German input from Kama. The vehicle weighed 5.3 tons, carried a crew of 2, and mounted either a 37mm cannon or a machine gun. Its armor, 8 to 16 millimeters thick, could stop rifle fire but not much else. Its top speed was 10 miles per hour on roads, considerably less cross-country. By conventional standards, it was already obsolete when production began in 1927. By Soviet standards, it was revolutionary because it existed at all. The manufacturing infrastructure required to produce even these primitive vehicles did not exist in Soviet industry. Factories had to be built, workers trained, supply chains established, all while maintaining the fiction that this was agricultural equipment production. The Bolshevik factory in Leningrad received contracts for 959 units between 1928 and 1931. Workers assembling turrets and installing weapons knew these were not tractors, but the official paperwork protected everyone involved. If authorities questioned the production, the documents were clear. These were heavy agricultural vehicles for industrial farming projects. The guns were never mentioned in export paperwork. The armor was described as reinforced panels for harsh conditions. The tracks were listed as heavy-duty transport systems. Every technical specification had an agricultural explanation that would satisfy inspectors who did not look too closely. Most inspectors did not look closely. The international community, exhausted from the Great War, desperately wanted to believe that nations were honoring their treaty obligations. The alternative, accepting that rearmament was happening in plain sight, would have required responses nobody wanted to contemplate. So the tractors continued rolling off production lines, and Soviet factories continued learning how to build armored fighting vehicles, while officially building nothing of the sort. The first combat deployment came in 1929 during border clashes with Chinese forces over the Eastern Railway. Soviet T-18 tanks, still officially designated as tractors in transport manifests, rolled into Manchuria. Chinese infantry, armed primarily with rifles and grenades, had never encountered armored vehicles. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Soldiers who could stand against cavalry charges and artillery barrages broke and ran when the steel monsters advanced. Bullets sparked off armor plating. Men died without ever scratching the machines, killing them. Soviet after-action reports described enemy forces fleeing in panic, abandoning positions that could have been held against conventional infantry. The tractors had proven themselves in blood, and Soviet military planners took careful note. If obsolete designs could terrify troops who had never faced armor, modern designs would be unstoppable. By 1936, Spain provided a larger testing ground. The Spanish Civil War became a proxy conflict where Soviet and German equipment faced each other while both nations officially remained neutral. Soviet T-26 tanks arrived in Spanish ports labeled as agricultural machinery. Nationalist forces knew better. These tractors had 45mm guns and could move at 28 miles per hour. German volunteers fighting for Franco's forces found themselves facing the very vehicles their engineers had helped develop at Kazan. The irony was not lost on anyone involved. One German account describes watching Soviet tanks advance near Madrid, while his unit's anti-tank rifles proved almost useless against the armor. The writer notes bitterly that German expertise had created weapons now killing German volunteers. The Winter War against Finland in 1939 provided the harshest test. Finnish forces, vastly outnumbered but fighting on home terrain, developed tactics specifically to counter Soviet armor. Molotov cocktails, satchel charges, and simple logs jammed into tracks destroyed hundreds of Soviet tanks in the opening months. The T-26, which had seemed invincible in Spain, burned easily when Finnish infantry got close enough. Finnish soldiers nicknamed them grave markers because disabled Soviet tanks littered the landscape like tombstones. Soviet tankers, inadequately trained and equipped with vehicles that were already outdated, died in appalling numbers. One Finnish unit reported destroying 17 Soviet tanks in a single engagement using nothing but improvised explosives and determination. The psychological advantage had reversed. Finnish troops no longer feared the tractors. They hunted them. Yet even in failure, the program had succeeded in its primary objective. The Soviet Union had developed domestic tank production capability, trained thousands of crews, established armored doctrine, and done all of this while maintaining enough plausible deniability that international intervention never materialized. By 1941, when Germany invaded the Soviet Union, Soviet factories were producing thousands of tanks monthly. The T-34, descendant of those early tractors, would become the most effective tank of World War II. The secret collaboration between Germany and the Soviet Union officially ended in 1933 when Hitler came to power and immediately began violating Versailles openly. The Kama facility closed. German engineers returned home. The fiction of agricultural equipment became unnecessary as both nations abandoned any pretense of treaty compliance. The Nazi regime began mass-producing tanks under their own designations. The Soviet Union accelerated armored vehicle development, no longer bothering with tractor terminology and domestic documents. The lies had served their purpose. Both nations had spent a decade developing the weapons and doctrine that would define the next war. The legacy of the tractor tanks extended far beyond their modest combat records. Soviet designers who had worked on the T-18 and T-26 applied those lessons to the T-34, creating a vehicle that balanced armor, mobility, and firepower better than any contemporary design. German engineers who had tested prototypes at Kazan returned to design the Panzer Mark III and IV, incorporating lessons learned on Soviet testing grounds. The collaboration had been mutually beneficial in ways neither nation could have predicted, and mutually catastrophic when those shared lessons were turned against each other. The political revelation of the collaboration came gradually after World War II as archives opened and participants published memoirs. The extent of German-Soviet military cooperation shocked historians who had assumed the 1941 invasion represented the first major interaction between the nation's armed forces. The reality was darker and more complex. Hitler's armies invaded the Soviet Union using tanks developed with Soviet assistance on Soviet soil. Stalin's armies defended using doctrine and vehicles refined through collaboration with German expertise. Both sides were fighting with weapons systems that bore the fingerprints of their future enemy. The moral ambiguity troubled Cold War narratives that required clear heroes and villains. How do you celebrate Soviet resistance against Nazi aggression when Soviet factories had helped create the Wehrmacht's armored capability? How do you condemn German militarism when that militarism developed partly through Soviet invitation? Modern military historians point to the tractor tank program as the clearest example of how arms control treaties, without enforcement mechanisms, simply drive weapons development underground. The Treaty of Versailles did not prevent German rearmament. It merely delayed and concealed it. Soviet industrial weakness did not prevent tank development. It merely required creative terminology. The tractors that rolled off assembly lines in Leningrad were always tanks, regardless of what the paperwork claimed. The soldiers who died facing them knew the truth, even if international observers preferred the comfortable fiction. December 1930. Kazan. German soldiers dive for cover as a tractor opens fire, and in that moment everyone understands that treaties are only as strong as the will to enforce them, and that will had died somewhere in the mud of the Great War.